Good afternoon in Europe, good evening in Asia, and good morning in the US. I'm Ellen Hexter from the Conference Board, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our special webcast, The Robots Are Coming, How Europe is Planning to Regulate AI. It's fair to say that the robots are already here, and since regulation always lags technology development, our webcast today is intended to shed some light on what companies need to think about and should expect from the EU. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Patrick van Ecke, a partner who heads the e-business team at the Brussels-based law firm DLA Piper. Patrick's been recognized as one of the world's top 20 IT lawyers and teaches at the University of London and the University of Antwerp. A couple of housekeeping items. Please feel free to type any questions into the question box on the lower left. If something needs explanation right away, I'll interrupt Patrick and ask for clarification. Otherwise, I'll hold questions until the end of the presentation. CPE credits are available for this webcast, so please stay with us and answer the questions as the boxes pop up. So at this point, Patrick, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you everyone to join this webcast of about an hour and spending an hour together with me and Ellen on some of the challenges and some of the regulatory developments happening in Europe, but also in the United States, actually, relating to artificial intelligence. And I don't know if you can see the slides because I can't see them right now.
We can see them.
You can see them, right. So, Ellen, you're going to have to tell me then on which slide I am because I've just got a gray screen, so just to let you know. But we shouldn't worry, that's probably some artificial intelligence that is helping us and assisting us. So thank you for that, Ellen. One of the things very often we read in the newspapers is that artificial intelligence is going to take over the world, that we need to be concerned, but is that really true? And we in different positions within a company, should we actually know more about artificial intelligence? And yes, obviously, that is indeed necessary. And for two reasons. Even if you're not engineers, we need to know more about artificial intelligence. And I would say the first reason, it's very simple. Our companies are all looking into artificial intelligence. Whether you are active in the healthcare, whether you're active in the petroleum industry, aviation, retail, it doesn't matter. Every CEO has already gone to Stanford, Berkeley, or here in Switzerland, or wherever, to actually to know more about artificial intelligence is able to enhance the efficiency of the organization. So, and they come to us, whether we're a director, HR, whether we're a legal counsel, whether we're in-house or external advisors, the people managing the business, they're coming to us asking, what are the risks? What are the challenges relating to artificial intelligence? What do I need to know in order to make sure that I can put a product, a service, which is AI enabled, how I can put it on the market? So that's one thing, why we need to know more about what's happening from a regulatory perspective. But the second thing is maybe a little bit more personal, namely, our CEOs are not just looking into producing or putting new products and services on the market. No, they're actually also looking into the internal processes much more efficient, which means they're looking into, are we still needed as human beings? Do we still need such a huge legal department? Do we still need such a huge HR department, a finance department? Do we need a risk auditor? Or can we replace this by artificial intelligence? And me as a lawyer, I am, of course, I am quite concerned about these things because, as you know, we do, the core of the work we do, it's about reviewing contracts, it's about entering into agreements, discussing these things, etc. And we do notice that we've got heavy competition now as counsel, as legal advisors. And just on the slide that you can see here about the non-disclosure agreement, you see a kind of experiment that has been done just a few months ago by Stanford Law School together with law geeks. And You know what they did? Well, they actually put some great lawyers with more than 20 years of experience in drafting and reviewing agreements, contracts. They've put them in a room next to a computer, which was AI enabled, and they asked both human beings, the lawyers, and the computer to review a few non-disclosure agreements. What was the result? Well, result number one, quite important from an efficiency perspective, was that yes, it was much, much faster to have the NDAs reviewed by a computer instead of by a human being. But the second thing, and that's the most worrying, I would say, it's the accuracy. Apparently, the computer was much more accurate than asking a lawyer, which is typically much more expensive than just having a computer and asking the computer to do these repetitive tasks again. So it shows that artificial intelligence, yes, it's out there. It's not going to go away. It's going to have an impact on the way organizations are shaped, on the way products and services are being put on the market. It's also going to have an impact on our personal life as a human being. And so what is artificial intelligence actually? And that's on the next slide. You find a few definitions. And what we notice is that very often AI is being explained to us by technical people who don't understand that we non-technical people, we don't get it. So the European Commission came up with a definition. That's what you see on the first part of the slide. But then you also notice that a few months later, they already came up with another definition of artificial intelligence, which is rather difficult to understand, I would say. So my personal definition, I've also put on the slide, it's a computer system that is learning by doing. It is learning whilst on the job. It's not any longer going to the local supermarket store or a computer store, buying a CD with Microsoft Office on it, using it for 2-3 years and bringing it back to the office, back to the shop, and actually the computer program would still exactly be the same as when you had bought it 3 years ago. This is over. Even with Microsoft Office, using Office 365, the system is learning by the way how you write documents. It's learning about the mistakes, the typos you make. And not just yours, but because Office 365 is in the cloud, it also learns from the thousands, the millions of other people that are making use of the similar system. That's artificial intelligence. The Office 365 that you would subscribe to today would be completely different if you would end your subscription, let's say, in about 3 years. That's learning on the job, as we as human beings are supposed to do, are always used to be acting as human beings. And you see on the next slides that there is indeed a rapid technological development and deployment of things, and any kind of industry sector is impacted by these things. On another slide, you see about a few charts with the share of jobs that it is requiring, etc. I'm not going to go too much into the details of those things. But for sure, and that is something you see on the next slide with Alibaba and Ekim and Google, you see a few examples where you notice that it's indeed happening everywhere. Even the pizzaiolos who are used to bake your pizza in the shop around the corner would be replaced by automated pizza bakers. When is this going to happen? When are we going to see the tipping point? Well, I had a few discussions with some technical engineers who are really into AI, and they told me that the only thing that is actually refraining us to go full force, full throttle into artificial intelligence, it's computer power. They're all waiting for the magic thing to happen, which is quantum computing. Once we get quantum computing, and we're going to get there in a few years, everything is going to go much, much faster. And so that to them is going to be the breakthrough of artificial intelligence. And now, of course, we as normal human beings, we might think ourselves, well, shouldn't we be concerned about these things? And sure, you and I, we probably have some concerns, and we might have some discussions on that as today. But actually, we are not the only ones having concerns. concerns. And that's what you see on the next slide, where you see, for example, quite an important guy in the field of AI, Elon Musk, who is also getting concerned and is actually raising some questions. He's even, as you can see on the slide, explicitly asking the regulator to regulate artificial intelligence before it's too late. On the next slide, you see, for example, Bill Gates, who is concerned about robots taking over the jobs from us human beings. And how are we then going to pay for the unemployed people? So he is raising his voice in order to ask for taxes. He would like robots, artificial intelligence systems, to be taxed, so that we do still have financial resource to come in to pay the poor people, us, who are out of job. So, and that actually brings me to a list of questions, which you can see here with a beautiful cyborg on the right hand of the slide. And these are the kind of questions that policymakers are asking themselves, but we also, as non-policymakers, I'm sure we all have had already these kind of questions. It's about very, I would say, self-evident kind of questions and concerns, like should robots be able to enter into agreements? Or should robots, as Bill Gates mentioned, should they be obliged to pay taxes? Should they also be held liable for damages? Would we accept a robot, artificial intelligence, to decide on the fate of a human being? It's already happening, as we know. We already have artificial intelligence-based systems that are into automated decision-making, where the system is going to decide whether or not you have the right for a subvention, you've got the right to get an additional fee, these kind of things. Another one, quite interesting, and I know it's getting weirder the more we go down to the bottom of the list of questions, but should robots be able to own property? An apartment, or intellectual property? Do they sing a song, for example? Should robots have some rights, like election rights? Should they be able to vote? Should they be able to inherit? Imagine. Should they be able to get married? These are, I do believe, very weird questions, but these are the questions that are being discussed right now in different parliaments, councils throughout the world. And let's just go a little bit deeper into a few of these. So one of them, for example, is can robots own IP rights? Here on this slide, and you can see on the right-hand side, you can see a beautiful artistic kind of chair that has not been invented, not been created by a human being, but by a piece of software. On the other side, on the right-hand side, you notice a very specific chip based on AI that is able to compose beautiful music, I would say. At least I would not be able to compose the kind of music that this chip is currently creating. I've put there a hyperlink. You can go there. You can listen to yourself. Of course, we probably have different tastes. That's not what it is about. It's a computer out of nothing creating, composing new music. Until now, no court has yet decided on the question whether or not a musical composition, a beautiful creation like this chair, should belong to the computer, to the robot, or should belong to the person who once, maybe many years ago, has drafted that piece of software that started to learn by doing. What we do know, and that's why I've put the monkey selfie case here also on the slide, because this is something that happened, and this is where we probably see where it's going to, at least the next few years. What happened here? Well, we had a journalist, a photographer, and he was in the woods, in the jungle, and he actually tried to make some pictures of monkeys, but actually he gave up, and he said, well, I never get a good picture. And so what did he do? He put his tripod there in the woods with the camera, and he just waited, and he just was waiting until something happened. And one of the monkeys, this one is called Naruto, she started experimenting with the camera, and she started making pictures of herself. That's fine, until the moment these pictures, they were being published on Wikimedia. Wikimedia, as you know, one of the spin-offs of Wikipedia. And so there the photographer said, you can't do that because I own the copyright on the pictures. Well, the lawyers of Wikimedia, they said, you don't do that. It's the monkey. And so the court or the case went to court, and it took quite a few years. There's a lot to read about it on the internet if you're interested more into that. But at the end, maybe too early days, I don't know. But at the end, the court decided that a monkey cannot have copyright, at least not yet. But you see, these kind of things is being discussed right now about animals. So you can imagine we might in the near future have similar discussions where a computer being represented by a lawyer is going to ask for some rights like copyright. And on the next slide, another example, it's about shall robots be held liable? We have the typical cases like connected cars, automated cars, which might crash and cause injury. And there, more and more often, we do see that it's very difficult to identify who should be held liable. The driver, who wasn't touching the steering wheel any longer, the car manufacturer, the software developer, the self-learning algorithm. We don't know any longer how these things should be solved. And then on the next slide about shall robots have rights, this again is the kind of weird thing, I would say, where sometimes people say, well, if robots become more and more into cognitive computing, into self-learning, in getting even emotions, why shouldn't we give them certain rights? And I do fully understand that this is a kind of crazy thing, that this is the kind of things we should not talk about. But let's move to the next slide, where you do see that there is a kind of evolution giving rights to others than human beings. You even notice that actually we as humans in the beginning, not every human being had similar rights. Women, slaves, only received similar rights than the other human beings, male people, many, many years or ages afterwards. It was just by changing the law that all human beings received similar rights. The second thing, it might sound weird, but actually it's not. We're all working in a company, an organization, having its very specific rights and obligations, as we all know. It's just a fiction. It's just based on corporate law, where we all decided together that we're going to give rights to a legal entity. And you can continue. We notice that rights are being given to animals. No copyright yet, but certain other rights are being given to animals, even to plants, even to ecosystems like the Amazon. So wouldn't be a next step be giving rights to artificial intelligence? That's one of the things that you might see happening in the future. And I know you may now say, I'm tuning off, I'm dropping off because this is a bit strange. Well, it's not. It already happened now, as you can see on the next slide. One robot has already been given civil rights, namely has been issued a passport by the country of Saudi Arabia. She's called Sophia. Contains some artificial intelligence, and in order for her to travel from one country to another country, she has been given by the government of Saudi Arabia, she has been given a passport, a travel passport. So she's officially registered as a citizen of the country of Saudi Arabia. I'm sure this is a kind of gimmick. It was to get some press attention, but still, you notice we're at the early beginnings. But what's going to happen in the next 50, 80, 100 years? So for sure, and that's something you can see on the next slide, there are quite some challenges. And I'm not going to sum these up, but it's about issues or concerns relating to discrimination. There are quite a few examples where artificial intelligence, for example, has come up with a decision which was impacting a human being, where actually there was based on a wrong algorithm, a wrong database. Some people were not able to receive the same rights because of the artificial system. A famous example, which is currently in court, is an Uber case in the United States, where Uber drivers, they do apparently sometimes when you have a license to drive and to work as an independent for Uber, you now and then apparently give that license to your neighbors, to your friends, to your nephews if you don't want to drive. So they are all working on one license. And so for Uber, in order to control that thing, they actually ask drivers now and then to take a selfie, a picture of themselves using their smartphone, and then based on artificial intelligence, the picture is then actually authorizing you to start working. If the system doesn't recognize you, you will not be able to open and activate the Uber driver's application. And so you're out of work that day. You simply can't start working as an Uber driver. Now, what has happened? Well, it happened to that the Uber artificial intelligence software apparently was much more stringent on people having a black background instead of a white Caucasian background, which meant that many people in the United States driving an Uber car and having a black racial background, they actually were simply prohibited to drive an Uber car, although they were the right license holders. And this case went to court and based on anti-discrimination. And it shows that quite often the problem doesn't lie in the quality of the camera or anything. No, the problem lies in the initial algorithm that is learning and that is working with models apparently being created typically nowadays by male Caucasian people using a database of male Caucasian people, which is much easier than to recognize the small distinctions between that kind of between that race, and having much more difficulties with other kind of people. So just one example, which is really a concern for policymakers. And I can continue, but I'm not going to do that. It's about, of course, I mentioned before, the unclear liability allocation, etc. But clearly, at least in Europe, this type of societal concerns has created the initiative or has actually initiated European policymakers to do something to start working on a regulatory framework for the European Union. And that's something that you can see on the next slide. There you can actually see, I've just put it in 5 different phases to show you that we are at this moment, we're still really at the beginning. It started about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, well, 5 years ago now, I need to say, back in 2015. I would say that was the moment that we could talk about planting the seed, so initial ideas coming up, still a kind of freewheeling. A few members of the European Parliament who came together, set up a kind of working group, said we should do something about it. And so they created first kind of resolutions, that kind of stuff. But then we actually moved into a second phase, which I would call feeding the grounds, based on that kind of freewheeling the years before. Then you start to notice that actually it's being formalized, and so that more politicians are supporting such kind of initiatives. And then we go to a third phase, which is the phase we're currently at, which is fertilizing the crops, I would call it. It is building the framework. It's starting to think, what kind of laws do we need to have? What kind of existing laws do we need to adapt? And then phase 5, we're going to have to wait for that. That's, I would call it harvesting time. It is the adoption of legislation, the implementation of legislation. So let's see how it goes. I would just like to bring you back to 2015, to the really beginning of the planting the seeds in Europe, because very important, I would say, is it's always good to go back to the beginnings, because there very often you notice the origin of some of the principles that we're probably going to find back in a few years into hardcore legislation. So the first thing, and I think it's a laugh, and I will explain you why it's a laugh. The first thing that happened was the European Parliament that did a public consultation asking citizens of Europe whether or not they think that AI should be regulated. We all know that in Europe we've got about 500 million people. And so this survey shows that 90% of the respondents said, yes, we need regulation for AI. But what you also see on this slide is that of those 500 million people, only 300 people responded. So I really would like to question actually the quality of this survey, but at least it's a European Parliament survey, and they use this survey to actually claim that, yes, apparently the citizens are waiting, are asking for a regulatory initiative. And so they came up, and that's what you can see on the next slide, with, after some consideration, they came up with a resolution. And so it took them 2 years. That's why I said about 3-5 years ago. It took them 2 years, back from 2015 to 2017, to build an initial resolution, which I would like to spend a few minutes on. It is clearly stating, and here already we notice a difference with the United States. This resolution already mentions that, yes, AI is a good thing, however. And what is the however? Well, it may infringe the rights of human beings. It may have anti-discrimination impact, etc., etc. And so the resolution is already asking for rules to be implemented in Europe. And something, what I believe is quite interesting, is that that resolution explicitly refers to what you see on the next slide, the 3 laws of robotics of the famous author Asimov. Asimov he's a literary figure. He is one who authored a few books on computers, on robots, but so it's literature. But here, the policymakers of Europe, they explicitly referred to the laws of robotics that you can find in this book, I, Robot. And indeed, I would say it makes sense, because the principles that he introduced many, many years ago already, more than 50 years ago, they are still valid. And it's like a robot may not injure a human being. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except when such orders would conflict with the first laws. A third rule is the robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. And the last one, and that's a new one, it's a 4th law that Asimov added a few years later because he noted there was an issue, that a robot may not harm humanity, or by inaction allow humanity to come to harm. And that is indeed interesting, because these principles, we're going to find them back all the way around. And I'm sure whenever there's going to be a European regulation, a European directive, or whatever kind of legal instrument, we're probably going to see something like this coming up as main principles. And so on the next slide, you see the building blocks of that resolution. And that's good. That's interesting, these building blocks, in the sense that they form, as it says, the building blocks of a future legal framework for Europe. And one of the main things is the European Parliament notices that you've got different forms of artificial intelligence, different forms of robots. And so they are urging for a classification of robots. They would actually like that we have different tiers of artificial intelligence, taking into account the level of intelligence such a robot has, but also the way how it looks and feels. How close is it to how a human being looks like? These are all part of a kind of classification that the European Parliament would like to have. Secondly, they also would like to have a registration duty for smart robots. Not necessarily for the vacuum cleaner we're currently having, which is containing some kind of artificial intelligence. No, just for the real high-level intelligence. Just as we have a license plate for a car, we're probably gonna need a license plate for robots. They also want to go deeper into civil liability. We'll come back to that. And what they also want to make sure is that companies, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth building block, they actually want that companies employing robots do a notification to the authorities. Why would that be necessary? Well, I would say this is the tax purposes reason, so that the authorities know how many robots you as a company employ, so that a specific tax in the next coming years can be added to the employment of these robots. It goes a bit further. So we also got a few rules, and the resolution calls it a license, but it's the kind of thing we're going to see in probably again in a directive or a regulation. And on the slide, license for designers, you're going to see that, for example, privacy is going to be very important. And they introduce a principle we already know from the GDPR, which is privacy by design, which states actually that the computer itself, the robot itself, should actually have should be designed in such a way that it is not privacy intrusive. Another one that I marked is an interesting one, I would say. It's kill switches. What is it? Well, they would like, the members of the European Parliament would like to have regulation that gives us as human beings, as users, the possibility to lock off, to put down, to switch off the robot when it's going berserk. Imagine you've got a few robots in your home, and for whatever kind of reason they're protesting, well, you're going to be able to use the kill switch and kill the robot. That's one of those things that we find in the resolution of the European Parliament. Another one, and that's what you see on the license for designers 2 slide. There you see that the European Parliament would like to make sure that we as human beings, that we realize whether or not we're talking to a robot. Again, this may sound a bit silly and a bit strange, but actually it's not. Remember a few months ago when Google was showing to the world its voice recognition system, which was really well advanced and which would allow you to call on your behalf a restaurant, for example, and make a restaurant reservation, a table reservation. Well, the restaurant owner was not aware that he was talking to a computer voice. He thought he was talking to a real human being. And this is concerning the policymakers. They do believe there should be a duty for computers, for robots, so for the developers of those robots, that there is a kind of identification system in place so that we already know, we always know beforehand whether or not we're going to have a discussion, we're going to transact with a human being or with a computer. Another one, that's license for users. And there, of course, that's about us. That's about us buying robots, using artificial intelligence. And so also there you see a few kind of rules that are going to be introduced. For example, you're not permitted to modify any robot to enable it to function as a weapon. That's one of the concerns of Elon Musk, for example. Going to the next slide, that's the thing about, should we also give electronic personality to robots? Well, the resolution of the European Parliament goes explicitly into that and says, yes, we should start thinking about giving rights and obligations to robots, not just to the users, not just to the developers, not just to the producers of this kind of artificial intelligence, but also to the robots themselves. However, what I see, and you will see that in a minute, the other policymakers, they actually didn't go that far. We see in the documents being built up by the European Commission, also by the White House, we actually notice that they do not go into these things yet. They actually keep it to the more, I would say, self-evident kind of challenges that need to be overcome when implementing artificial intelligence. So let's maybe go to phase two. And I do notice, Alan, we are quite on time. So I think we're doing well. But please let me know if I'm going too fast or if I'm going too slow.
Nope, I think you're doing fine, and we're doing well with time.
Thank you, Alan. So what's happening now? We got the European members or the members of the European Parliament who made quite some, well, they made quite some havoc about the resolution. We should do something about it. And so that moved us, at least in Europe, into phase two, which I call feeding the ground. Is getting much more formal support. And this is exactly what happened a year ago and also in 2018. One of the very important milestones, if I could say so, is the fact that the member states, and that's what you can see on the next slide, is actually they all signed. That's no. The first thing I want to show is the roadmap. That's something typical, I would say, European. We like to do these kind of things, so showing that we've got a plan. And so this is the EU roadmap on artificial intelligence 2018-2019. And there indeed you can see the different actions being taken, the different milestones being taken. So you see the ship is slowly starting to leave the harbor. We are going slowly into a direction of regulating artificial intelligence. The politicians are being set up to support, and that's what you can also see on the next slide with those people signing some documents. These are 25 member states that all signed up to a kind of agreement that we should have financial investments in artificial intelligence, but also a regulatory framework for Europe on artificial intelligence. And this, of course, this brings me then to the next slide, because that's exactly what the European Commission wants, to get that kind of support from the politicians to take an initiative. And so it ended up in a European Commission communication. It's not a law yet, but we're starting to see where it's heading to. This is a communication. This is what the Commission says we think we should do as the EU policymakers. And here it clearly states that they say, yes, we need to do something. We need to go into a regulatory framework, and they point to a few things. What they also did during that period, phase two, and that's an interesting one because I haven't seen it in any other region, the European Commission appointed an expert group of ethical people, or how do you call it, of people having an ethical background, thinking about ethics, so philosophers, but also economists, sociologists. They brought them together thinking about not how a law should look like, but what should be the main ethical principles that we as a society should adhere to whenever we're gonna go further into the development of artificial intelligence, of robots. And that's what you find here into the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence. So it's a kind of report, very welcome to read it, but I'm gonna go one stage further, because what do you see now? Well, with the new commission coming into place, with the new president, Ursula von der Leyen, she actually, in her maiden speech, she mentioned explicitly, I'm gonna use my first 100 days to come up with a legal initiative relating to artificial intelligence. And that's quite interesting because she was the first such high official who clearly made such a kind of statement. We don't have a legal instrument yet, but you will see in a few minutes that it's distilling, it's crystallizing. We are going into a kind of specific direction. And that brings me actually to the next phase, which is today. This is really what's happening now, I would say 2020, and it's probably going to take another 2 years, I would say. And what is it? Well, it is indeed crystallizing what the ideas that come from that resolution from the European Parliament, the ideas of that ethics committee, etc. again, initiated by some commissioners, like the new Justice Commissioner Didier Reynders, who introduced a new term, which we should probably keep in mind, stating that in terms of how AI could impact consumer rights, I would advocate for an ethics by design approach. It's a new kind of sexy term that Didier Reynders introduced. We're probably going to hear more about ethics by design when we're discussing artificial intelligence. But also, one of the main voices in Europe, Margaret Vestager from Denmark, she also mentioned that, yes, AI has great opportunities, but it also comes with great risks. And she's got strong reservations with the blanket application of some technologies, and in AI technologies in particular. And then she focuses on one very specific kind of technology, which we will be talking about in the next few minutes as well, which is facial recognition software, because there something is happening, as we will see in a moment. And so that brings me to something that happened just last week, because when I was preparing the slides, I thought, well, this is where I should stop. This is no further news. It's somewhere in the pipelines. But of course, just last week, a white paper got leaked. I'm sure it's on purpose, as is quite often is the case with leaked documents. But here on this slide, you see a leaked white paper. It's the second time already that a white paper from the Commission based on AI or relating to artificial intelligence got leaked. And this one, I can share, and Ellen, I will afterwards, I will share the document with you. So because it's always interesting, it still contains some typos, it still contains some things between brackets, but it really shows where the European Commission is going into, which kind of direction. Anyhow, on the February 17th, this white paper is going to be finalized and it's going to be public, going to be made public. But so what it does do, it's going a little bit deeper into some details and about the way how Europe would like to regulate artificial intelligence. And you see on the next slide, for example, that they provide in the white paper 5 regulatory options. One, it's a kind of labeling, voluntary labeling, which would mean that you're not obliged to follow the requirements, but if you want to get a label, a kind of quality label, well, you need to follow the requirements of, let's say, ethics by design, privacy by design, transparency, all these kind of things we already discussed a few minutes ago. That's one option that the European Commission would like to put forward. A second one is, well, maybe we don't need to come up with one all-encompassing regulatory framework for artificial intelligence. Maybe it's just enough to go into some very specific sectors. Public administration, for example. Facial recognition, for example. And so that's one other option where they say, well, we're going to stay apart. We're going to stay away from a generic piece of legislation. We're just going to do some very specific laws and rules on very specific AI-based applications. A third option, it's a bit more of the same, I would say. It's actually we would like, and then I mean the European Commission, they would like to go into a kind of assessment about what are the high-risk artificial intelligence products and services, the ones that really have a high impact on human beings. And once they have identified that kind of list, well, they would like to come up with very specific dedicated rules on that one. That's option number 3. Option number 4, that is about safety and liability. And that's quite an interesting one because, as we all know, in Europe, we do have some very specific rules on safety and liability. But actually, these rules, they typically go about product liability, product safety. And the whole discussion going on in the field of artificial intelligence is this a product? Is AI a product or is it a service? It's not clear, and it should be clear. We should make sure that we know for 100% for sure whether or not the product liability directive and other safety regulations, etc., do apply to artificial intelligence. And so there we're probably going to see that this type of legislation that we have already for so many years in Europe, that actually it's going to be amended, the scope is going to be broadened so that artificial intelligence solutions would also become part of that. And then the last option is about governance. It is, of course, because we're in Europe, the European Commission would like to set up a kind of authority, a European authority, national authorities that actually would govern these kind of things. You can think of that's the kind of authorities, just as data protection authorities, competition authorities, that's the kind of agencies or authorities that actually the European Commission is thinking of. These are the kind of things you find in the white paper. But you also find a little bit more about liability, for example, and that's what you can see on the slide with the poor guy who's actually, I'm sure he's not going to survive this attack by his dear robot, but we're actually, the European Commission in its white paper clearly says that we should find a proper risk allocation. We should make sure we know that there are many stakeholders in the ecosystem of artificial intelligence. Yes, it's the robots, but it's also the users, it's the developers, it's the producers, and so each of those has very specific responsibilities. And what I want to clarify in a legal instrument, or maybe just in guidelines, is who is responsible for what. And of course, as a consequence, who is going to be liable for what, taking into account their responsibilities. The white paper doesn't go any further than just mentioning that they're going to take initiative on this liability and responsibility allocation. But one thing they do, and that's something that you see on the next slide, is, and I'm really wondering if this is going to stay in the final white paper that's going to be published on the 17th of February. But one of the things that you're going to read in the white paper, the draft at least, the leaked version, is that the European Commission plans to prohibit facial recognition based on artificial intelligence in public spaces. This, I would say, and they even put a number of years in the white paper, they say, well, we think about, because it's still unclear what should be done with facial recognition. We hear a lot about it in metro places, in public areas, shopping malls. We also hear governments, public administrations doing things, but also private players working with facial recognition. And we don't know yet how to regulate it. And so that's what I put in the white paper, and that's why I'm concerned. They actually state, well, we think we should have a 3 to 5 years prohibition to have facial recognition on European territory in public spaces, so that we, the lawmakers, can have some time to do a proper risk assessment. That's heavy. I mean, this is also why I've put on top of the slide as a title, is actually EU regulation going to inhibit, to put hurdles on the development of artificial intelligence? And no surprise, and that's what you can see on the next slide, United States, they immediately reacted, not just on the facial recognition thing, but actually on the fact that Europe is thinking of coming up with a regulatory framework on artificial intelligence. And so here actually, just again, the beginning of this month, January, there was a public appearance of the chief technology of the White House, Michael Kratsios, clearly stating, we don't want Europe to go into regulating artificial intelligence. This to me is a typical discussion we've seen in the past, where we all know in Europe we like to regulate. You could even say that in Europe you can't do anything unless it's allowed by law. And in the United States, you can do anything unless it's prohibited by law. But here again, we do see, and we've seen the same thing in the discussion on privacy and data protection, that actually United States takes a much more kind of liberal approach, like let the market first develop, let's try to correct if it's necessary, but don't take any preemptive kind of measures. And so this is what we see is indeed happening in the field of artificial intelligence. The EU wants to regulate, probably I would say too early, and the United States says, no, don't do it. Now, on the next few slides, you do see the principles that the United States actually also has put forward. And these are principles, I've also marked it in yellow. It's actually not principles to regulate, but it's principles to avoid over-regulation. This document that has been made public, again, just about 2 weeks ago, this document from the US government, it's a message, it's a kind of directions to local lawmakers and also the public administrations to tell them, look, if you are thinking about regulating artificial intelligence, go through these assessments, go through those principles. And if indeed at the end you still notice there is a need for a law or for amending the law, yes, please do it. But don't take it for granted. Don't become too enthusiastic, starting to think about artificial intelligence. It's the new kid on the block. We need to regulate it. So that's the US approach. And here on the next slide, you see Michael Kratsios, who really says we should go for a risk assessment. We should go for a cost-benefit analysis, which is indeed completely different approach than in Europe. Now, on the other hand, what we see is that Europe, they actually, with the AI regulatory initiatives, they would like to redo the success of what they call the success of the GDPR. We all know that data protection has been very close to the heart of the European policymakers, and they started with the Data Protection Directive and now with the GDPR, which is the 2.0 version of the Data Protection Directive. And the United States always stated, we don't want to have rules on privacy and data protection. Well, what do we see now? Many years afterwards, United States even, as many other countries, is adopting data protection related rules, just as we have in Europe. First state is California with the CCPA, but there is also federal legislation in the making. So one thing that I'm a bit concerned about is that the United States, I believe that instead of stating we are not going to regulate and Europe, you should not regulate, they might miss the ball, because Europe is not going to stop. They're going to produce rules. They're going to be very proud, just as with GDPR. They're going to do a kind of evangelizing of the world on the beautiful principles that they developed on artificial intelligence. And so United States, I think, at the end, and then I'm just thinking about the next 15 years or so, not earlier, they probably going to have to follow if the AI laws in Europe have become a success and might also be adopted in other parts of the world. So that actually brings me to the end, because phase 4 and phase 5, it's still an empty slide, as you can see. We don't know yet what's going to happen. We do know, I mentioned it before, the ship has left the harbor, the rocket is going into the sky, but we don't know yet where it is actually going to land. On the next few slides, I actually just, for your information, I've put a few kind of typical kind of principles, typical kind of requirements that I see popping up when policymakers are talking about developing a legal framework for AI. So these are just my own personal thoughts. It's not something I took from the European Commission or anybody else, but it's about what I see, the three main principles that I always see coming back. One of them, the first pillar, it is, for example, respect for human rights and democratic values. We're going to see that everywhere in any piece of artificial intelligence legislation. That's what we're going to see. A second one, it's about liability and accountability, for sure. We want to make sure that there's going to be somebody or something, maybe it's an insurance, maybe it's a fund, but that the victim of damage is going to be paid for the damages. And then the third one, obviously, it is indeed about transparency in the broad sense, knowing that the other side is a computer or not, knowing that what is actually the reasoning behind a computer decision when it's being made by artificial intelligence. Why is my pension lower than I had expected? It's just a computer that decided on that. What's the algorithm behind it? That's the kind of transparency rules that we also probably going to see popping up in AI-based legislation. And this is actually where it ends. These are just my thoughts where in less than 1 hour, I wanted to share with you about what's happening. And as you can see, it's a moving target. I'm sure if we're going to see each other in another 6 months or another year, we're going to have this story is to be continued. There's going to be much more interesting stuff to come up. Thank you very much. I hand over back to you, Ellen.
Thank you, Patrick. As I said to you the first time I heard you talk about this, this is such a complex area where there's so many factors that need to be considered. So a couple questions, because you just were talking about transparency. And I would also invite anybody listening, if you have a question, please type it into the question box on the lower left. If companies are required by regulation to explain how their AI works, isn't that giving away IP?
That's a very good question indeed, Alan. And this is the main concern of many organizations, many companies who say, well, we don't want to share the algorithm. We don't want to share much more information because this is our IP. On the other hand, we do notice, and this is in the resolution, so back to 2017, it's not, I haven't seen it yet in the white paper of the European Commission, but the members of the European Parliament, which are always much more, I would say, consumer-oriented or citizen-oriented, they explicitly ask for open source code, so that anything that is being put in a robot can actually be read, can be used, and that you don't need to go back to the producer, to the developer. So I do believe that the concern you raise is a very valid concern, and I also believe that's something I forgot to mention. The white paper of the European Commission, when being published on the 17th of February, is going to have a very clear invitation to the markets to come up with feedback, comments, suggestions, concerns. And so I would really invite anybody on the call, any industry sector, any kind of organization to really make sure that your voice is heard, because it's happening now. And we also know from experience that once a commission official is picking up a pencil, starting to draft a law, it's very, very difficult to get that person away and have that person to start something completely different. You can still discuss about the details, but the principles, once put it down on paper, it's very difficult to change them. Now it needs to happen. If we want to influence the policymakers, make sure they make good decisions, both for society as well as for organizations and companies, it's now time actually to have these discussions with the policymakers.
Okay, well, Patrick, thank you. I just want to let people know the slides will be available. We'll also get I guess a somewhat clandestine leaked copy of the EU document to give companies a heads up on where the EU is going in terms of regulation. Fortunately, I have lots more questions, but we've run out of time, and I want to again thank Patrick van Eke for his insight and expertise, and thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.